Okay students, so this is the homework for this week. I just thought I'd go through the case study first before we look at the questions, just to explain a few things. So the case study says the World Trade Organization's trade report provided useful insights into the pattern of global trade. So this case study is around the pattern of global trade, and if you remember, that's kind of where the flows of trade are between regions and within regions. Changes in comparative advantage for selected countries and industries, and a summary of some aspects of the global pattern of trade. The extent of intra-industry trade is measured using an index. The closer to 100, the more significant intra-industry trade is for a country. So what that means is kind of trade between, say, car manufacturers and other car manufacturers, or within that supply chain. The closer the index is to 0, the more a country imports and exports goods and services produced by different industries. So if there's a number of different industries and that country produces a lot of different things, then they'd be closer to 0. And it says figure 4.5 shows changes in comparative advantage for selected industries and countries. So if we have a little look at that data now, so this data is showing, to start with, the trade between developed and developing countries over time. So the main time frame we've got is from 1990 to 2011 for all of the data, and what you can see is trade between developed countries stays roughly about the same. About half of all trade is between developed countries. Trade between developed and developing countries again stays about the same over time, and trade between developing countries stays about the same over time. So even though trade is increasing, the percentages are staying about the same. If we look down at this bottom graph here, what this shows is the difference between intra-regional and inter-regional trade. So intra is the light grey one, and inter-regional is the darker one. So as you can see over all of the graphs, there is an increase in trade, and as you can see kind of in some areas, so in North America, that's stayed roughly about the same, but increased slightly in terms of intra-regional, so within the North America, and shrank slightly in terms of inter between North America and other places. In terms of Europe, again, there has been a slight reduction so the EU is an interesting one, and then it looks like the intra-regional trade is reducing over time. But if you look at the little bit of information there, it says excluding EU intra-regional trade. So Europe here is including all of the countries of Europe, including, say, Turkey and countries that aren't in the EU. So there they are trading a bit less, and they are trading more with the rest of the world. Not significantly so, but over time a little bit. Middle East, huge increase in trade again, so across all graphs, but for the Middle East there is now a significant amount of intra-regional trade. Same for the former Soviet states. Asia, more intra-regional. Africa, more intra-regional. Central America, more intra-regional. So there's a trend of more trade across the time, but there's also kind of more trade within regions as well as across the world. So intra-regional trade becoming more significant. The last couple of charts here, so index of intra-industry trade for selected countries. Remember, the higher the number, the more important it is. And for the same countries, it's about the same. So these countries here, significant amount of intra-industry trade. At the bottom here, kind of more developing countries, less significant. Now this is one of the important tables which will link into the question. You've got countries gaining comparative advantage and countries losing comparative advantage. So secondary goods here, office and telecom equipment, machinery, as in the machines that make some of those other goods, the capital goods. So you can see countries gaining it. China is a significant one here. It's gaining in all of them. Chile is gaining in all of them. Mexico gaining in all of them. So some of these are kind of developing countries, some of them are developed, so Poland gaining significantly there, Korea gaining significantly there, Hong Kong there, going across countries, losing a lot of developed countries here, so Australia, Finland, UK, Sweden, Australia, Ireland, Italy, and so on. Some interesting countries, so Russia has lost manufacturing, not really because it's moving up, but just because it's being less efficient. So the first question, assess the extent to which the theory of comparative advantage explains the patterns of global trade. So what you have is that increased intra-regional trade. So what you'd want to do is, on one side, it's yes, the theory of comparative advantage is explaining the patterns in trade, and then no, it's not. On the yes side, you want to explain the graph. So either you could have it as two graphs if you wanted to, with different comparative advantages. You'd always have your starting points before specialization. You would add your new specializations on, and then from that you would have the trade between them. What you are gaining here is a significant amount in relation to what you're losing here, so that's your lowest relative opportunity cost. What you're gaining here is greater than what you're losing here, and then the trade that would occur between them would give you extra. Now what you would have, because you're getting more of the other good, as a point outside of your PPF on both of them, where you would be trading. So one of the benefits of comparative advantages that you trade outside the PPF. The question here is about the pattern of global trade, so it needs to be linked to either some kind of intra-regional trade or increases in total trade, and especially when you look at those kind of charts which show you the gaining and losing comparative advantage. So the increases in trade between developed and developing might be to do with China gaining a comparative advantage in something, but you also have examples where a country loses a comparative advantage, so for example the EU, but there is an increase in intra-regional, or again the US losing it and an increase in intra-regional. In terms of countries gaining comparative advantage, so some of those African and Asian economies, you might be able to link those into some of those increases in intra-regional within those developing areas. So the intra-regional does link to the pattern of global trade for intra-developing countries, but it doesn't explain why there's more intra-regional trade in developed countries. And that's more to do with free trade deals or bilateral free trade deals like the EU. So you've got on one side comparative advantage based on specializations, based on low opportunity cost. On the other side you have free trade bilateral deals actually distorting that and it not being the reason for that. The other reasons can be things like that consumers have preferences, so choice, so we prefer German cars to maybe a cheap Chinese car. It can also be to do with that there are levels of protectionism which distort this as well. The last question is discuss whether an economy will always benefit when the current account of the balance of payments moves from a deficit to a surplus. So you've got one side which is yes, you've got the other side which is no, and you've got the it depends upon. In terms of yes, moving from a deficit to a surplus will increase aggregate demand, so you're going to have the benefits of economic growth, lower unemployment, and the reduction or the increase in standard of living as production or as incomes rise. On the no side, you have the demand. You don't just need an extra graph, but you need to show the demand pull inflation. You can talk about real incomes here, falling if inflation is rising too fast. You could also talk about the opportunity cost of production being greater than consumption. In terms of it depends upon, you could look at the cause. So what is it caused by, and then make a judgment about why. Maybe if it's a supply side or structural issue, like education, this is better than if it's just to do with a weak pound.